Well, thank you, Jane. And in terms of having a life, I'm an incredibly fortunate man, and one of the great opportunities I've had is to serve in public office, particularly to serve in the House and then the Senate, to be in leadership in both places. And I intend to make the most of every day of the rest of this year and then see what happens after that. Just like Ron White's book, I'm always ready for the next chapter. And I did that as I read the American Ulysses. And Ron White was I think, one of the three historians that really have restored General Grant to his place in history. Ron White's book, H.W. Brand's book, the subtitle of which was The Man Who Saved the Union. If that doesn't say everything that needs to be said, I don't know how I'd say it. And of course, Ron Chernow's book. And then to be here in the restored Grant Monument, that hasn't gotten the attention it deserved over time. In fact, yesterday we were driving somewhere else, and one of my staff asked, "Now, where is the Grant Monument?" And I said, "Well, that's right down there by that reflecting pool at the base of the Capitol." And Brett Blanton, who went to the Naval Academy with my son Matt, responsible for restoring this monument to one of our great Army heroes, but one of our great military heroes. And I think Ron White and others have made the case a great president at an important time. And I want to talk about that a little bit. But first, let me talk about my two sponsors of the Grant resolution honoring the bicentennial of his birth, Ann Wagner from St. Louis, who represents Dent Home in St. Louis, Whitehaven, which is a national park because of the Grant association with Whitehaven. And then my other good friend, Sherrod Brown. And when I went to Sherrod, I said, I've got a Missouri reason for this in addition to a personal reason, but certainly as an Ohioan, you should have a reason to want to be the other sponsor of this bill. And he was glad to do that. I think he'll have some remarks virtually a little bit later. The Grant, Missouri history is really pretty deep. His first appointment posting after West Point was at Jefferson Barracks, which was the first posting for an awful lot of graduates of West Point. And his roommate, Fred Dent, his roommate from West Point, was there as well. And so he wound up going with his roommate to Whitehaven, a place where his roommate had grown up. And at he would, I think, have said the most important moment of his life, met Fred Dent's sister, Julia. And a few years later, they're married, and his life is always better and more stable and more focused when Julia Grant is around, and that proved true for the rest of his life and the rest of their life together. They spent quite a bit of time at Whitehaven, 5 years living there, but even as president, Grant spent a lot of time at Whitehaven. They established a stable that's still there today. His mastery and love of horses was very much evident at Whitehaven. And then on Grant's farm, where eventually the house he built at Whitehaven is moved, named it with some humor, I guess, Hardscrabble Farm. And it's the only standing house, and maybe the only house built by hand by an American president. And you could go to that location there. The Grants didn't live there very long, but he built that house and lived in that house, and still standing today. So that's important. Grant comes back to the Army as the Civil War starts. Another Missouri moment for him is the first battle he really commands is in northern Missouri, and it's during that battle, Ron White, that I think he discovers that however many concerns he had about meeting the enemy was just as concerned about meeting him, and he never forgot that as he began to move forward. Moving forward, he got in that northern Missouri service. His first notice that he personally got that he had been appointed to a general's position was reading it in a paper called the Daily Missouri Democrat. and that's when Grant found out that he was going to be General Grant, and of course was from then on. The Civil War story, I think, is well told, but it's better told over time and better told by the three people I mentioned, one of whom is going to speak here after me. So I don't want to get in too much detail about what I think is what I know about General Grant. We've got somebody here who knows everything about General Grant and is going to talk about that. But when I see this statue, sort of Grant huddled on that horse, and by the way, people who saw General Grant on a horse, whether it was at West Point, where he did unbelievable things in horsemanship, or during his entire career. At the Battle of Belmont, he rode a horse back. The last person to get on the boat that they were using to move the Army, he rode a horse down the gangplank, which is almost impossible to do, but General Grant was truly a master of horsemanship. But here on a horse, huddled sort of against all of the elements. And when I see this, I always think of that moment that I've read about at Shiloh, where at the end of the first day of Shiloh, where the Army had been surprised, Grant had been previously injured and was not as connected the day before as he might normally be to what was going on there. The Army had been surprised, had a really bad first day. Grant was, at the end of the day, in the dark, sort of leaning against a tree, under some light rain, and Sherman comes up and says, "Well, we really had a bad day today," or something like that. And Grant's response, as he's huddled there under that tree, is, "We'll whip them tomorrow, though." And he always was able to look toward the future and never, according to Sherman and others, never really upset in the middle of the battle. He could keep his wits about him when everybody else had lost theirs, and it made him truly a great general. And was under some dispute, frankly, at the centennial of the Civil War, but by the 150th anniversary of the war, the true great generalship of Grant was more deeply appreciated than it had been. And because of these three books I've mentioned, I think Grant's presidency seen in a different way than it was after the return of a sense of the lost cause and the birth of the nation. If you didn't respect the effort at Reconstruction, which was incredibly important in the 8 years after the war, if you didn't appreciate the effort at Reconstruction, you couldn't appreciate Grant. And Reconstruction was demonized, particularly under the Wilson administration, that movie that was shown at the White House, The Birth of a Nation. And Grant's reputation suffered for more than 50 years after that, after that demonization, in my opinion. In fact, driving over today, I said, well, when was the bill passed to create the Grant Memorial, which was dedicated 100 years ago at the Grant Centennial? And the answer was 1901, where Americans were still referring to Grant as one of the three great presidents. You know, if you look back and read the history of Reconstruction, where everything that Grant did was wrong and everything the government did was wrong, you wouldn't believe that decades after his death, many people, including Theodore Roosevelt during his presidency, would refer to Washington, Lincoln, and Grant as the three great presidents. Now, that is not somebody who, on the centennial of his birth, would have been held in disrepute, but still greatly respected. I'm glad to see the monument restored. I'm glad to see Grant's reputation being reviewed. Nobody is perfect. And Grant certainly would have understood that he wasn't perfect either. But as we look in a different view at the lost cause narrative of the Civil War, as we look at a different way of the importance of Reconstruction, as we look at the sadness in the Wilson administration where the federal workforce is resegregated, we have reason to think about Grant in a way that these great historians have presented what I think is a much more appropriate story of Grant. And so here we are at a restored monument at a time when President Grant is being viewed in a way that General Grant was generally always viewed. I'm glad to see those things happen. I'm certainly glad to be here with you today. Ann Wagner, Sherrod Brown, and I yesterday sent a letter to the Secretary of Defense asking that Grant be given the rank of General of the Armies. Only two people have ever had that rank. One was Pershing after World War I, and one was Washington, given to Washington as part of the Bicentennial in 1976. It would seem to me that the Bicentennial of Grant's birth would be exactly the right time to bestow that rank on this person, in H.W. Brand's words, the man who saved the Union. I am delighted to be able to be here today. Thank you to all of you.